according to our outline, the fourth page, the next thing to do after just giving you an introduction to the MRs, which we did last Friday night, is to provide you some examples of the mystery religions. We start with the worship of Serapis. We go through Cybele. Number 3 should have an S on it. I left an S off of Mithras. Mithras should have an S on your outline. Now that you've already written it, I might add, wait till you get a black pen so that it all matches. So you'll have to pick up a new outline now. Mithras, it should be, ending with an S. Now we're either going to look at 3 or 4 of those tonight. Numbers 4 and 5 are the big ones. And so 5 definitely I do not want to look at tonight. I want to save that. 4, it just depends on where I am about 50 minutes from now. If I'm okay, then we might jump into number 4. If not, then we'll stop with Mithras. And we still have letters C and D to do. Worship of Serapis. Serapis. Now you'll see this mystery religion. Have you ever heard of this, Serapis? You may have heard it under a different term. You'll see this under 2 different heads. Either under its Greek name, Serapis, because it was imported into Greece, and then later through Greece to Rome, and thus the name was Hellenized. Or you'll see it under its Egyptian name, which is its original name, which is probably how you generally will see it, which is Osiris, Osiris. And another name that you need along with that is Isis. Osiris, Isis. Osiris is the same as Serapis. Serapis is the Hellenized form, the Greek form. Osiris is the transliterated Egyptian form of the name. Now, Isis is the sister and wife of Serapis or Osiris. I put it down on the outline as Serapis just because that's the Greek name, but it is an Egyptian religion. It starts off as an Egyptian religion. So you could know it by either name, or by both. You could know it by both, as Serapis and Osiris. Okay, let's start with the history of this then. Remember last time we kind of ended with a general look at the characteristics of the mystery religions. And I was very general in those characteristics. I gave you characteristics that I really will not add to, except one. At the very end of our study of Serapis, I want to add one that I didn't want to say then because I wanted it to register on you more tonight, separated from the other characteristics. But you'll have to take these and fit these back under those characteristics, and you can elaborate those characteristics. I just gave them to you in very general, broad terms. You find out how they're individualized in actuality under each one or one or the other of these MRs. Now, the history of the worship of Serapis is an ancient one. Its worship goes back in different forms way into early Egyptian history. But it really becomes an important mythology based in Alexandria, somewhere in the 400s or 300s BC. Now, the Greeks brought the worship of Serapis under their new name Osiris, or Osiris under their new name Serapis, to their land with the conquest of Alexander the Great. Now that ties in with where we were last week. Remember our discussion of syncretism, that these leaders, such as Alexander, these nations, such as the Roman people in the West who traveled to the East, picked up these mystery religions, the early beginnings of them, mixed them with their state religion, mixed them with maybe their pantheon they already had, came out with a syncretistic form of worship. And so here's a good case of that. Of course, we know that Alexander the Great did go down to Egypt, or we never would have had a city named Alexandria, although I think he named more than 30 cities Alexandria somewhere in the world after himself. Of course, he had no pride, we're certain of that. But he had to have been there in Egypt, or he never would have named the city Alexandria. It later spreads from Greece to Rome, because Rome conquers Greece next. And by 80 BC, the beginning of the 1st century before Christ, a serapeum, or a temple, existed in Rome. And numerous temples to Isis could be found throughout Rome, throughout Italy, as well as over into Greece. In 30 BC, Augustus had all the temples destroyed. And 2 years later, in 28 BC, the Senate passed laws against the worship of Serapis because of the flagrant immorality involved in their religion, which is one of those chief characteristics of the MRs. So it has a checkered history in Greece and Rome. Sometimes it's in vogue and sometimes it's out. So with Augustus Caesar and the Roman Senate in 30 to 28 BC, it's out. But over the next few years, it begins to grow again. And so in AD 19, now we're up into the time of Christ, Tiberius Caesar destroyed the newest shrine which had been built in Rome and had all of the priests of Serapis crucified. Seems like for the most part then, the Roman authorities were opposed to this form of mystery religion. For the most part, starting way back with Augustus in 30 BC, right up into and through the life of Christ, we could say, the Roman authorities, the official position is one that is anti the worship of Serapis. However, Caligula, Roman emperor shortly thereafter, brought the worship of Serapis right into his palace. He was inducted as an initiate, and so were his family members. And then finally, under Nero in the 7th decade of the 1st century AD, laws were passed which made the worship of Serapis a recognized religion in the Roman Empire. So all persecution, all destruction of the religious monuments was by law ceased. The later Flavian emperors also participated in the worship of Serapis. So it really gains an official stronghold, we might say then, toward the end, that is in Greece and Rome, toward the end of the 1st century AD. Although by this time it's probably been in existence for maybe 400 or 500 years. Now, just what is the story of Serapis then? What is this religion all about? Well, Serapis, or Osiris, whenever he appeared to men, he always appeared in the form of a bull. And one day, when he appeared, he was caught and killed and dismembered by his brother, Set, S-E-T, who was god of darkness and evil. You see, the Greeks and the Romans then would have their comparable gods that would correspond to those as it originally manifested itself in Egypt. And here's where his sister wife Isis then comes into the picture. Now he has been dismembered, and the parts of his body have been scattered all around the world. Here a little and there a little. Isis, his sister wife, and notice the immorality involved right here. He's married to his full-blooded sister. Isis searched the world over diligently, looking for his bodily parts. She found them piece by piece, hidden in caves and hollowed out trees and under rocks and boulders, in graves. She searched the world over, found all of his bodily parts, put them back together again, reminds you of Humpty Dumpty, and brought him back to life, breathed life into him and brought him back to life. Now, what was another feature, characteristic of the mystery religions but the death of a daughter, a son, a lover, something like that, and their resurrection? And that has to be due to the fact, and you get one of these Erdman's handbooks, and I'm sure you could find somewhere in there a discussion of, if it's not well, probably wouldn't be in a book on Christianity, maybe world religions, somewhere a discussion of all of the ancient forms of worship and religion, besides that of the Hebrews, that somehow was based upon nature. It's based upon agriculture, as we have discussed so many times. You're probably tired of hearing that. But it's interesting how all of these forms of religion somehow are connected to that. And here again we've got the subject of resurrection, which obviously would be taking place sometime in the spring. She then has a son by Osiris, one Horus, Horus, who was the god of culture and wisdom. The god of culture and wisdom. Now let's look at the ceremony involved in the worship of Osiris, Serapis, as well as Isis. By the way, Isis was worshipped equally with Osiris or Serapis. So it's really, I put on the outline the worship of Serapis. You could put Isis beside that, because it's a worship of Isis as well. Now remember again about the MRs that upon pain of death, people were not to reveal any of the secrets of initiation. So it's only almost happen chance or various other circumstances like conversion of some Christians who had been in these MRs that we even know anything about the secrecy of the initiation ceremony. So the mysteries are only partially known. Now here for Serapis, we know a little bit about the ceremonies through a work entitled The Golden Ass, written by perhaps a 2nd century Roman writer, Apuleius. Now Apuleius, A-P-U-L-E-I-U-S, A-P-U-L-E-I-U-S. Apuleius had been initiated into the worship of Serapis at Corinth, which shows it's way up in Greece then. And although he, of course, was not supposed to write about it, the golden ass is the story of a man who gets turned into an ass by a witch, and then it gets reversed. But through this all, we have some insight also into the worship of Osiris and his sister wife Isis. He was not supposed to reveal any information, but he was a Roman writer, and so he wrote about his experiences. He said that they would have a 10-day ceremony that would be comprised of various forms of ascetic preparation. You know, whenever you're going to be a hedonist next week, you like to be an ascetic this week to justify next week. So they have a 10-day ceremony of ascetic preparation. That way you're ready to indulge when the time comes. Various washings, perhaps baptisms, some form of other lustrations perhaps, as well as public marches through the streets of the city to celebrate both the grief and the joy of this religion. Grief over the capture, death, and dismemberment of Osiris, and of course joy over the fact that Isis has located all of his bodily parts, collected them, put him back together, and raised him back to life. Now, we could wish we had a little more, but that's about all we have. We know that it's something like a 10-day ceremony of ascetic preparation, various lustrations, which may have included things such as washings or baptisms, and public marches to celebrate the joy that ends after the grief that begins in the worship of the religion of Serapis. Now, something that I have saved for now, because if we get far enough to get down to Dionysus or Bacchus, which I don't know if we will tonight, but even if we don't, it applies to Cybele, it applies to Serapis and some others, not to Mithras so. But something I've saved until tonight to really major on and to point out as a characteristic of these mystery religions is the profound attachment and abundance of women to these forms of religion. Much more so than men. And then I want to give you some suggestions why this is true, about 5 suggestions why this is true. And I think that these cannot be gainsaid. Now, the worship of Serapis involved both men and women. Remember, if most of these end up as some type of orgy, the odds are you probably have both sexes there. That's not necessarily true, as we'll see in a moment, but most of the time that's probably true. Those who don't have both sexes probably don't have sexual orgies involved, although it'd be possible, but it'd have to be homosexual experiences in. But it's very noticeable to most people as you study these mystery religions that large numbers of women flock to them, large numbers of women, especially what we might call younger women, women in their 20s, women in their 30s. Old women probably had better things to do. They were beyond the stage of orgies anyway, I guess. So it's women generally in their 20s or 30s who were very much influenced by and attracted to these religions. Here's some suggestions why. First of all, it just seems like women are attracted to religion more quickly than are men. Now that's not only true for that which is false, but for that which is true as well. We're probably a little unique in that we have a good balance here of men and women. If anything, I think we probably have more men around here. But if not, it's fairly close. Whereas in most churches, you'll find many, many women there. You find many, many women coming, and their husbands, of course, staying at home. A second suggestion of mine is that women, and not just mine, of just different things that I've read, but I think it fits the case of the characteristics that we gave you last week. Women are more prone to be abstract and mystical. Women are more prone to be abstract and mystical. Men are more practical, nuts and bolts, hands-on type of people. We have scripture for this, Genesis chapter 3. Why is it that, and that's a whole story in itself. Remember, we've studied those first 11 chapters of Genesis only from an historical and scientific point of view, never from a theological point of view. Why is it that the serpent comes to Eve? Why not to Adam? He's intelligent, remember. He's not going to make gross mistakes. Here is his one opportunity, perhaps his only opportunity. What if, let's hypothesize for a moment, what if Eve had turned him down? That might have just been the end of the kingdom of darkness, and God would just start the millennium right away, and they would propagate and have children born in a holy fashion, righteous children without original sin. That's hypothesizing, but what would have happened if she would have turned him down? Well, of course, the sad end of the story is she didn't turn him down. But the interesting point here is, why didn't the serpent go to Adam? Except he probably realized that he couldn't get Adam. That the one that he had the best opportunity of attracting is Eve. And he goes and reasons with her, and she starts thinking and sounds good. And first of all, she rebuffs him, but then she listens a second time. Yes, God said. Well, that gets her thinking, well, God has said, oh, you'll be like God. Oh, that sounds good. Abstract, metaphysical. I'll be like God, knowing good and evil. All Adam wants to do is take care of the garden. God said, take care of the garden. Men, many times, are more practical, hands-on oriented people. They just want to get their business done. And women, they like to sit around and think about things. Now, of course, you can always find exceptions. You can find men who sit around lazily and want to think, and women who are hands-on and practical. But it's a good suggestion, I think, that women are more prone to be abstract and mystical. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul points out very specifically there that Eve was beguiled by Satan. She was lied to, all right, but more than that. Much, much more than that. I don't think the lie was nearly as important as the subtlety of Satan. She was beguiled by him. And then thirdly, we're looking at some scriptural references under this second point. Who is not familiar with that interesting passage in 1 Timothy chapter 2? You might want to turn there, verses 11 through 15. Now, this isn't really off the subject. We're talking about mystery religions, and they did attract large numbers of women, female devotees versus men. And since, you would see that, if you're studying this at all and you're a student of these things, you ought to pause long enough to ask yourself, well, now, why is that the case? And then see what type of answers you can come up with. But I might add, although it does relate specifically tonight to MRs, we could use this in a number of other places in a study of women and womanhood, a study of ethics and a study of theology and a study of psychology, human personality, human growth and development, and a number of things there. Regardless of what the secularists want to say out there, God's Word has certain things to say. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but she must be silent. Now, I don't think that's just an arbitrary, lacking in love commandment of the Apostle Paul. It's certainly a commandment. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. Seems like then he traces his logic and his reasoning way back to the creation ordinances and the fall. For Adam was formed first. There's back to the creation ordinances, then Eve. There's one form of the argument. Who came first? But Adam. Adam was formed first, then Eve. The fall. Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Now, elsewhere, where Paul needs to deal with the whole subject of the race of mankind as a fallen people, such as in Romans chapter 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, then, of course, he picks Adam because he's the representative head. He was the head of the family that was composed of Adam and Eve. But here, where he's not talking about, original sin or inherited guilt or depravity, but he's talking about the role of women, then he points out something else. He doesn't go on to say, now, Adam fell and sinned after his wife Eve. We already know that. We'd know that from other teachings of Paul. We'd know that from the book of Romans. He never mentions Eve there. It's Adam, sinned. And, of course, if we're familiar with Genesis, we would know it from that source as well. But Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. They're more abstract and mystical. They are more easily deceived then. Well, let's move on. And you might think there are many false cults that have been initiated by women. You can think right away of people like Mary Baker Eddy and Ellen G. White and others, although more by men, just because there are more men out there who are going to get involved in some of these things. But a number of them, those are two famous ones here in this country by Mary Baker Eddy and Ellen G. White that have been begun by women. Then in the third place, another suggestion why women are so prevalent in these mystery religions, they're more easily excitable in their emotions. And these religions certainly appeal to one's emotions. Men are supposed to be, they generally are, it seems like, more cold and formal and distant. And women are more reachable and touchable, which then may explain the second point I just gave you, which then may explain the first point. I think they all really tie together. I don't have them in any particular order here, except the order in which they came to my mind. Then in the fourth place, women of antiquity received very little recognition. And that's held true up until just modern decades here in this country. So here's a place where they can finally exert themselves, be important, be counted. So maybe due to their little recognition in the past. Now you have to combine this with these first 3 points that I've already given you. They're already kind of inclined toward this area, toward something like this appealing to them. Now, there are no hard, fast rules here. You can find some men. By the way, according to 1 Timothy chapter 2, men should not be easily deceived. They shouldn't be the one with mystical, false notions about things. If anyone's going to have that, it should be a woman. But, of course, there are no hard, fast rules. You find many men who have mystical, abstract, metaphysical notions about things that can't be supported in Scripture. Generally, they have their feet on the ground better than women. It's just because of the nature of their constitution as well as a lot of other things. But You know, I think of a lot of these charismatic meetings that I've been a part of. Yes, a lot of mystical men, but a lot of shrieking women too, though. They're the ones who want to get up there and babble away in their prophecies and everything and don't make any sense at all. They like that emotion involved in that form of religion. It's not a put down of them, it's just stating the fact of the matter. If it's a fact, it's not a put down, it's just a fact. And then finally, and here's something that's very interesting, the home life arrangement for most women throughout history has caused them to adopt a false martyr outlook on their existence and calling. They long for a brighter future or hope. Men generally, you see, are fairly satisfied. They get to work and be with people, be out in the world, quote, accomplish things, end of quote, that can be seen, reported. And women seem to live an endless cycle. And so because of the home life, what I mean by that is women at home raising children. Because of the home life arrangement, most women throughout history have adopted a false martyr outlook on their calling. In other words, they always tend to feel so sorry for themselves. They're stuck at home. Their husband is off accomplishing big things in a broad world. And the women look and long for a brighter future and hope. And so why not, if this is the case, why not, after you've put the children to bed and your husband's home from work, and some of these things, many of these mystery religions, such as Dionysus, did take place at night, why not slip out the bedroom window, the back door, and go to the mountains and have fun with some other women in some of these mystery religions? Now, you don't think that's true? Then why is it we still have women around that will do things very similar to that? They can hardly wait to get everyone down and quiet, and they'll slip out for, carousing around the town, dropping by bars. Yes, women with children, married women with children will do that. Get their children in bed and head out. And they'll be home 2 or 3 the next morning. It's perverse and gross what happens, but it happens. Maybe you've never known anyone who would do such things. But see, the man, he tends to be accomplished and feel accomplished from all that he's done that day. And he's ready to come home and the day is over with. And the woman has just lived an endless cycle that day. So she is ready to do something. She is ready for some type of outlet of exertion and of experience. And so the mystery religions seem to offer an ideal setting for something like that, versus some of these other forms of religion. Now this is opening up a whole ball of wax that, of course, we don't even dare get into right now. But think of a religion like Judaism. I mean, it was male-oriented, male-dominated. They were the priests. They were the Levites. Most of the Nazarites were men. I mean, they were the prophets. A few women. They were the statesmen. Only a few women. They were the kings. Only one queen, and she was false. It was male-oriented, male-dominated. And, of course, you find the same in the Christian church, if we believe what Paul says here in 1 Timothy 2. And so when you've got religions like that, Judaism and Christianity, a lot of women aren't pleased with that. They don't accept that. That's not enough for them. And so that's why we have people rewriting in their experience passages like 1 Timothy 2 today in charismatic circles. That's not good enough for them. Surely this couldn't be. They don't want to think that this is the way Christianity really is. And this is going to be the way it is with me for the rest of my life, being bound to some of these teachings that the apostle gives here in the New Testament. So they recreate the whole situation and almost in effect dream up a charismatic MR, a charismatic mystery religion. So this would be an escape for them, an escape from duties of the home with meals, with laundry, with children, with husbands, which is not something new today. Women have had that all through history. There have been mouths to feed and clothes to wash. So this Serapis MR was really, in fact, a monotheistic form of pantheism. The devotees believed in only one God, as is true with most of the mystery religions. They are mystery religions with devotees attached to one particular God. See, that's why it's different than the pantheons with many gods. Most of them are monotheistic, but of course their monotheism is idolatry as well, because they're worshiping that which is not, or that who is not, because they're not worshiping the true God of Israel or of the church. It's pantheism because it's very difficult to get a grasp on the nature of this God, where he lives, who or what he really is. He's kind of everything and everywhere. So it's a monotheistic form of pantheism. We do know that Serapis or Osiris was referred to as the Lord of totality. The Lord of totality. So it was monotheism. He was often referred to, with Serapis, with his Greek name, he was often referred to as, you know what that is in Greek? Soter. Now, do you remember what we discussed before about this term? What's that mean? Lord. Became a name for Jesus Christ, and of course so did Soter. Soter was used by some of the Ptolemy kings, as we discussed earlier in ITP, and of course it's used of our Savior, the only real Savior, in places like Titus chapter 2 and verse 13. Speaking of the blessed hope, looking for the appearing, to use the better punctuation, which is probably true of the NIV versus the KJV of Titus 2:13, looking for the appearing of our great God and Soter, comma, Jesus Christ. The comma is in a different place in the KJV. NIV is probably more correct there. Titus 2:13, Jesus is referred to as the Soter, as our great God and Soter, Savior. But Serapis was referred to as Lord of totality, as Soter. He was the sun god, and he was the God of miraculous healing.
For the continuation of the...
But Serapis was referred to as Lord of totality, as Soter. He was the sun god, and he was the God of miraculous healing. Of all things, we're really having little mercy on the charismatics here. His temples were actually referred to as clinics for supernatural healing. Of course, it was demonic, but he was the God of supernatural, miraculous healing. Medicine maker, sun god, Lord of totality. Now, we spend a lot of time on that because a lot of the things here is we're going to give you examples. I'm going to look at several examples with you of the mystery religions. And a lot of the things found here with Serapis are the same with all of the other mystery religions, as we already saw last week in looking at characteristics that could generally be superimposed on any mystery religion with just a few alterations here or there. So let's come briefly to a second mystery religion, the worship of Cybele, Cybele. We won't say nearly as much, just a sentence or two, because a lot is the same as Serapis. Of course, the story is going to be different, and who the god or goddess is, this happens to be a goddess now, would be different. The ceremonies, well, would have to make alterations here or there, but essentially they're going to be the same, because they involve all of this secrecy, knowledge being passed down, lustrations or baptism or washings. Mostly women predominate in the worship. Sacrifices with blood, sexual matters, all types of things. Cybele was a Phrygian goddess. Now, Phrygia was a province in Asia Minor, very near the city of Colossae. Or I could say cities of Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis. Phrygia probably bordered on the eastern part of Asia. Asia was one province in Asia Minor. And then later the whole thing became known as Asia Minor. But Asia, Ephesus was the capital and chief city in Asia. But Phrygia is right there. Paul would have traveled right through Phrygia. A Phrygian goddess of nature that also was transplanted, as was Osiris, to Greece, then later to Rome. Again, it had to do with the rebirth of nature in the springtime. Almost all of them have to do with this. Women predominated, but men were also allowed in this religion. It appears that in the frenzy of some of the ceremonies, the emotional state became so high that the male devotees would castrate themselves. And Cybele was in fact served by a consort of eunuch high priests. She had no priestesses, as many of these MRs did have. They had high priestesses. But Cybele was served by a consort of high priests who had all been castrated. They were all eunuchs. Okay, thirdly, let's come to Mithras. Mithras. Next one on the outline, add an S to it, Mithras. Now, one writer has estimated this might have been, with the exception of Judaism, the strongest opponent that Christianity had to face. I'm not for sure that's true, but I've read that one scholar who's well known and reliable had to say this. But that Mithraism was the strongest opponent Christianity had to face, beginning in the 2nd century A.D. Of course, by then, she's really no longer facing Judaism. So you might could say the strongest after Judaism, and that struggle has passed off the scene. Have you ever heard of Mithraism? It was a soldier's cult. The army of Rome was the one all wrapped up in Mithraism. Now, Mithraism originated in ancient Persia. See, so many of these are Egyptian or Oriental forms of religion that came into contact with Greece or Rome somehow and then were transplanted back there and incorporated into their existing form of religion, coming up with a new, third, a syncretistic form of religion. We're seeing this in almost all of the cases here. Now, Mithraism had contact with Rome chiefly during 2 periods and through 2 episodes. Firstly, through the Mithridatic Wars. Now, the names happen to be very similar, Mithras and Mithridatic. But Mithridates was the king of Pontus that we discussed way early in the political section of ITP. Rome waged several wars and finally a successful war against Mithridates. And there were several kings. It was a dynastic title for the kings of Pontus. And I think it was like Mithridates IV. From the years 88 to 63 BC, the Mithridatic Wars, from 88 to 63 BC. Now, the people of Pontus were involved in Mithraism, the worship of Mithras. So Rome came into contact, but since they were fighting wars with Mithridates, who would have been the people coming into contact? Well, the soldiers. They would have been the ones fighting the wars. And then a second period, a second episode, would have been the Mesopotamian Wars, fought by Trajan in the early 2nd century A.D. Now this is A.D. now. The Mesopotamian Wars against the Parthian Empire, fought by Trajan in the early 2nd century A.D. So returning veterans would have brought Mithraism home with them. Mithraeums, another name for their temples, Mithraeums or shrines with inscriptions, have been found all over Europe. Many have been found in the Rhineland of Germany. And a great surprise was after the World War II Luftwaffe bombings of Great Britain and particularly London, the clearing away of the rubble and the rebuilding, a Mithraeum was actually discovered and found in London. That's how far this spread, from Persia through Greece back to Rome. But we know that Rome, the Romans went all the way to England, went all the way through France, all the way through Spain, went all the way to England. So it was a great surprise when this was discovered not that many years ago. And all the clearings of the World War II bombings of the city of London, they discovered a Mithraeum, a temple to Mithras. Now, let's look a little at the ceremony. He also was the sun god. See, they're all sun gods because the sun would be the most important thing in the ancient world. Just as important to us, we just don't realize it today. We think that we're self-sufficient because we think we get things from the store, but where does the store get them, though? Just turn the sun off and we all perish, of course. The sun is still important. He was the God of light, the God of purity, the God of truth. Well, all those things you could see would somehow be connected with sunshine, light and purity and truth. But again, regretfully, we only know bits and pieces of the rites, and we only know them in an unconnected fashion. But we do know this, that the ceremonies took place in underground chapels built in caves, entered from a spiral staircase, perhaps from above. It's like going into a mine shaft or something, but not one of these in the side of a hill. This is straight down, vertically, not horizontally. The stairway would end on one side of a large rectangular hall called the Hall of Assembly. I'll try to tell you enough that you can picture a lot of this in your mind. Here you'd find in the center of the room a table, on that a perpetual flame burned, which symbolized truth. God of truth and light and purity, which would symbolize truth. Now this hall of assembly, as it was called, could seat up to 100 men on benches around the sides. At one end of the hall was kept always a statue of Mithras. He would be a young man with cap and cape wrapped around his shoulders, sitting on a bull's back, thrusting a sacrificial knife into his throat. Now, the center of the hall would basically be bare, with the exception of the table and the perpetual flame symbolizing truth. The men would ring the hall, a rectangular shape, on benches against the wall. The center of the hall was where the ceremony took place. Masks and costumes were used as they enacted plays. And according to one cryptic writing, the initiates went through 7 steps of initiation that each had a certain name. We don't know why or what all these names mean, but I'll give you these 7 names, though. Initiates would go through a 7-step ceremony, and each step would have a different name. Okay, step 1 was called the raven. Step 2, the hidden one. Step 3, the soldier. Then the lion. Then the Persian. Number 6, the messenger of the sun. And the final step was Father. You would become united with the deity then. You would recognize him as your Father. I think the last point we ended on last Friday night was the fact that as you go through these steps of initiation, and that was just in a general description by another writer, you'd finally end up with the step that one realized he was beloved of the gods. Love, salvation, mercy, kindness, those things were always absent in all of the ancient religions, and they still are today, with the exception of true religions like the Judeo-Christian faith. Now, they later then had to go through various trials of strength, endurance, and courage. Now, remember, we're talking about men. By the way, if you haven't gathered this already, this was solely a cult for men. They had to be soldiers. Only soldiers could participate in Mithraism. And all soldiers were men. So this was really appealing, to their ego, being military veterans, soldiers. That would just be the thing to appeal to them. Go through various trials of strength and endurance and courage. Tertullian, the church writer of the 2nd century A.D., gives us one tidbit about these later trials. He tells us that when one of the potential initiates was presented at sword's point with a crown, then the initiate was to reject it, saying, "Mithras is my crown." They had to pass through flames of fire while bound, and were thrown into lakes and rivers while all tied up, which was symbolizing victory over death. Now, how would you like to be thrown into a river all bound up? But of course, they were supposed to survive. Some didn't. You had to find a way to get back to the top and get out of there. Maybe a lake would be better than a river. I guess it would depend on the current of the river. Now, because it was composed of soldiers, that means women were excluded. And because women were excluded, that means this particular MR, Mithraism, lacked sexual indulgences, so prevalent in the others, as you already know. So now here's an exception. The characteristics we said basically are true for all, with some alterations here and there. But because it was composed of soldiers, it had no women. And because it had no women, all sensuality was ruled out. It was really a machoism type cult for veteran army soldiers of the Roman military machine. Now, it had one thing in common with the worship of Cybele, the one we just discussed a moment ago. So this goes under both of them, but I wanted to save it for Mithraism. It had one thing common that we do know in the ceremonies of both of these, which again shows the interconnections between two entirely different mystery religions, Cybele involving many women and Mithraism involving only men. A bull was slaughtered above, and its blood dripped down through a grate on the worshippers below, somewhere probably in the middle of the ceremony, which would mean you'd have to be underground then for both of these. Now, we know that Mithraism took place underground because their chapel was in an underground cave. So you'd have a bull up there, you'd have like a metal grate over the bull, you'd slit the bull's throat, and of course he'd die there on top of the grate, let the blood drip down through the grate, and the initiates would have to walk under that. Now, you may have never heard of this, but I'm hearing of it all the time, and so I want to mention it. If you'll turn over to Matthew 24. You hear a lot more, you read a lot more about Mithraism than you do Serapis or Cybele. We're kind of looking at these, not totally in order, but in some type of order, because the last two, numbers 4 and 5 on your outline, are really well known, extremely well known and important. And Mithraism would probably fall behind that, maybe Serapis behind that, and Cybele would come first. But we knew more about Serapis and Cybele. That's why I began with Serapis, so I could describe it and then just impute some of its characteristics to our study of Cybele, which was the second one. Matthew chapter 24. Did I tell you the chapter? Matthew 24. Well, I see the verse, but I want to read a few leading up to this. We know this is an eschatological passage here. Jesus left the temple, was walking away, when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. And then later in verse 3, they're on the Mount of Olives, and they ask him questions, and he says in verse 4, "Watch out that no man deceive you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. And at that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate one another, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, as you go throughout this passage, all the way through it, you compare Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21, you have an extremely, extremely difficult prophetic portion of Scripture. And what do I mean by that? I mean difficult to interpret. Does it apply to the first century fall of the city of Jerusalem? Does it apply to something that's going to precede the tribulation period? Does it describe something taking place in the tribulation? Does it describe that final battle over in Revelation 20 after the tribulation and before, and after the millennium? Or just, in fact, what does it describe? You find various opinions, or a combination of some of the above. Verse 15 is what we want. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And the Christians did. They went to Pella, somewhere about halfway through the war, which began in 66 and finished in 70, and they left about 68. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. Now, if this was a Christian prophecy, why would we be concerned whether it took place on the Sabbath or not? Now, the Jews would be very concerned. According to the rabbinical courts, they could only go a Sabbath day's journey from their home. And so when you throw Sabbath in, that throws a whole kink into the interpretation of this prophecy. Now, our brother who got Dr. Carson's commentary on Matthew, I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about it. I'm not familiar with whether or not he's got the correct opinion or not, what I would feel to be correct, although I have read Carson's whole commentary. For then there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. That time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if it were possible. So I've told you ahead of time. Now you say, well, now, where's something about Mithraism in here? I thought we were back with mystery religions, not eschatology. Well, did you see it? Probably not. But you generally hit this if you're reading something about Matthew or Mark or Luke, or even other places. Pardon? Well, verse 15. What is this abomination of desolation? Now, we've discussed that before in ITP, way back when we were studying Daniel chapter 11, I believe. Sacrifice, what really is this abomination of desolation? Well, one opinion was the military Roman standards, like the standard or the flag or the color bearer that would go before the army. The Roman standards had designs on them. I forget exactly what they had on them. But they were Roman soldiers, remember, at this time. And they paid homage. The Roman soldiers who would camp, just like Israel of the Old Testament, they would have a certain standard that would represent a certain tribe. The whole tribe would congregate around that. The soldiers of a particular battalion or whatever would stand or camp around their particular Roman standard and pay homage to the image on the standard. And maybe it was more than pay homage. The homage was such homage, it was probably worship they were paying to it. And so is a theory that what we're being taught here in Matthew 24:15 is that Jesus has reference to the Roman invasion, conquering of the city in AD 70, because these are Roman soldiers practicing the worship of Mithras, and this is the abomination that causes desolation. That the Romans actually brought their standard bearing an emblem of Mithraism into the temple, and this is what was prophesied by Daniel. Now, my opinion of that is that it is a totally false theory. but I come across it too many times to not say something about it tonight, since we are talking about Mithraism. And it does concern itself with Matthew 24:15. As far as I'm concerned, that's a totally false theory, but you do see it just too many times not to take an opportunity now to say something of it. I think we've got to get back into Daniel, as we've done earlier on these tapes, although we certainly didn't go into very much detail then, and study more of what Daniel said. Jesus said, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. So we really have to know what Daniel's talking about and how that was fulfilled, or how he felt it was going to be fulfilled in the future. And then try to draw some parallels with what's taking place in AD 70, if this is even what he's talking about here. You see, there's one of the central problems with this passage. Is he talking about, well, it says the holy place, and he probably has reference to the temple there. Is he talking about a rebuilt temple, according to dispensationalism, that the Jews, perhaps sometime in the 20th century, maybe early 21st, will rebuild a temple in Jerusalem so that a lot of these prophecies can be fulfilled? One of those, they would say, perhaps being Matthew 24:15. Or did it have reference back to AD 70, or can it have a double application, or is there any such thing in biblical hermeneutics as a double application? So it's just a very complex issue we don't want to get into. But I will alert you to the fact that I don't think Mithraism is that which is under consideration in these eschatological passages.
You mentioned that there was a statue of Mithras in the temple, and that it had he was sacrificing himself with a knife. Is that?
He was killing the bull.
Oh, he's killing
Yeah,
the
he's
bull?
riding on the back of the bull, thrusting the knife into the bull's throat,
Okay.
not his throat.
Okay, but it sounded like you were saying.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that. No, sacrificing the bull, which showed his strength. That was to show strength, which again would apply to the macho Roman veteran soldiers there.
He did not owe, I owed a debt I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away. And now I sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. All day long, Christ Jesus paid a debt that I could never pay. He paid a debt that he did not owe, and I owed a debt I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away. And now I sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. All day long, Christ Jesus paid a debt that I could never, never, never pay. He paid a debt that he did not owe, and I owed a debt that I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away.